just as you said. They did not believe until it was too late. Their slave soldiers threw down their spears and surrendered.
And Daario Naharis?
How could this happen to me? I made my mistakes, got nowhere to run. The night goes on as I'm fading away.
Good evening, you yodeling yokesters, and welcome to episode 14 of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and sit back as we discuss today's subject, the Omega Simp of Westeros and beyond, Jorah Mormont. This rewrite was a bit of a strange case, since from the series' inception, I always intended to give Jorah a rewrite, and yet while rewatching his arc in the show, well, there isn't anything really all that wrong with it. Jorah's character is completely defined by his love for Dany. Throughout the first 4 seasons, we see Jorah, a disgraced former Westerosian, who originally began serving Dany in order to spy on her for the Master of Whispers, develop a deep admiration for his queen, and while his romantic feelings are in no way reciprocated, Jorah's relationship with Dany is one of her most cherished and significant. That is until Dany discovers Jorah's employment by Varys, and despite the fact that he is clearly regretful, she banishes him. He returns with Tyrion Lannister as an offering, but he is once again rebuffed. But instead of wallowing in his sorrow, in what I would say is one of the most pimp moments of the series, Jorah returns and enters the fighting pits. As Jorah looks up at his queen, asking not for her romantic love, but simply permission to fight for her. By this point, he knows it ain't gonna happen, but it seems he has come to accept that to some extent, and decides to dedicate his life to her, even if she wants nothing to do with him. But in a moment of true connection, showing the depth of their relationship, Dany gives into his wish and allows him to fight for her. At the end of season 6, their relationship has been repaired. Yet it seems like it's on a different plane, if you will. By this point, Jorah has come to terms with the fact that Dany will never feel for him as he does for her. Dany sees the depth of Jorah's admiration and takes him back into her service, but unfortunately, due to Jorah contracting grayscale in season 5, he is forced to flee, promising Dany that he will find a cure and return to her side. Jorah keeps his promise, having his grayscale cured by Samwell Tarly, and returns to Dany in season 7, and ends up dying in her arms in season 8. When laid out like this, I actually think Jorah's arc in the show is pretty solid. And while I wouldn't say I prefer his arc in the show as opposed to the book, I will say that show Jorah is, how do I put this, a lot less difficult than book Jorah. Book Jorah is in general a lot less sympathetic than show Jorah, and his pining after Dany has a much more pervy vibe to it. Keep in mind that this may be due to the fact that 1, we almost exclusively get our read on Jorah through Dany's POV, and since she is a 13-year-old getting game run on her by a balding 40-something-year-old dude, well, I think that sentence speaks for itself. And 2, while the age gap between Dany and Jorah in the show is basically the same as in the book, Dany is aged up 3 years from 13 to 16. By the time we get to, say, season 4 or 5, I feel like the age difference doesn't really register. Emilia Clarke was in her 20s, and Ian Glenn was looking hella good for his late 40s. And the show doesn't really harp on the ages of the characters all that much anyway. I think the show writers sort of shied away from focusing on the age gap between them in order to make their shipping a little less weird. Whereas in the book, the fact that 40-something-year-old Jorah has the hots for mid-teen Dany is always apparent. We also get a lot more in the way of background on Jorah in the book, which makes things, well, even more difficult. As we know, Jorah fled Westeros after he attempted to make money off of the slave trade. As for why he decided to do this, as he explains,
I had no money and an expensive wife.
And that's all we get. But in the book, we learn Jorah was first married to a girl from House Glover, and they were together for a full decade until she unfortunately passed due to complications from her 3rd miscarriage. Jorah went on to become well known among the 7 Kingdoms as a talented knight, but unfortunately that came to an end when Jorah married his second wife, Lynese Hightower, who was, like Dany, a hell of a lot younger than Jorah. They married for love, but after they settled down on Bear Island, Lynese, more accustomed to the life of luxury she enjoyed before her marriage to Jorah, wasn't vibing with the simple life. In order to satiate the expensive taste of his wife, Jorah ran himself into financial ruin, and it was his numerous outstanding debts that led him to work in the slave trade. So yeah, already Jorah is a hell of a lot more of a reply guy than he is in the show, but holy shit, the depth of Jorah's simp status does not end there. Though not detailed in the show, Lynese actually flees with Jorah when he leaves Westeros, and seemingly not having learned his lesson, Jorah goes right back to trying to meet his wife's luxurious needs. He once again runs himself into debt and resorts to working as a sellsword to cover his expenses. Meanwhile, Lynese shacks up with a wealthy merchant by the name of Trigger Ormalin, leaving Jorah absolutely cucked. Jorah putzes around Essos for a while until he is eventually hired by Varys to spy on and relay the actions of Daenerys and Viserys Targaryen, which is where we catch up with him at the start of the series. So taking all of that into account, it puts Jorah's infatuation with Dany in a much slimier light. In the show, Jorah's love for Dany seems to be due to her genuine personality and heart. But in the book, Jorah is so awkward around women that he just wants her because she is one of the few women who has given him any sort of positive attention, as if Jorah isn't in love with Dany as a person, but as a concept, an idea. It characterizes Jorah as someone who doesn't have a firm grasp on reality or any sense of self-awareness. The fact that Jorah ran himself into financial ruin in Westeros, which is what led him to work in the slave trade, and then busted his line of credit again when he fled to Essos, it clearly communicates that Jorah isn't the most confident or mature man, and doesn't seem to learn from his mistakes. In the book, Jorah is quite stubborn when it comes to taking responsibility for the position he finds himself in, and he would rather make excuses for his various misfortunes. All of this makes book Jorah a lot more complex, but a lot less sympathetic and charismatic. However, unlike in the case of Tyrion, where his show charisma resulted in the writers changing his arc substantially, thus throwing off his character trajectory, Jorah's interpretation in the show doesn't derail the plot in any significant way, probably due to the fact that he is more of a secondary character. It is interesting to note that book Jorah is one of the few characters whose arc trajectory isn't all that predictable. As evident in previous episodes, I personally have a vague idea as to where each character will end up come the end of the series. Not so with Jorah. In the books, Jorah and Tyrion are still on their way back to Dany. However, in the book, Dany has already fled from Meereen and has been taken captive by Khal Draco. So Jorah and Tyrion probably won't meet up with Dany until she returns to Meereen. The reason this is odd is that Jorah's interaction with Dany in the fighting pits before she flees on Drogon lead to the reconciliation at the end of Season 6, and later allows him to return to her service after curing his grayscale in Season 7. But in the book, Jorah most likely won't meet up with Dany until after she returns to Meereen. And since there was no reconciliation, I can't see Dany bringing Jorah back into her service before they head for Westeros. Perhaps she will due to the hallucination of him she had at the end of A Dance with Dragons, but the most likely scenario will see Dany banishing Jorah once again before she makes her way to Dragonstone. As for where he will go from there, it's totally up in the air. There is a possibility, though I am not sure how likely it is, that the end of Jorah's story may not have to do with Dany at all. In the books, as he is dying following the mutiny of Craster's Keep, Jorah Mormont calls to Samwell Tarly and, with his dying breath, asks him to contact Jorah and have him return to Westeros and take the Black, repenting for his past crimes. So perhaps it will be Jorah eventually fulfilling his father's dying wish that will serve as his redemption. Given the fact that Jorah gives his dying request to Sam, it is likely that Sam and Jorah will eventually meet up in the books as they do in the show. Although, since Jorah does not contract grayscale in the book, Jorah and Sam's meetup will of course most likely be under different circumstances. I actually like this perspective ending for Jorah. Perhaps Jorah is exiled once again by Dany when she returns to Meereen, and while brooding in Essos, he runs into Sam who informs him of his father's dying request. Jorah returns to Westeros and joins the Night's Watch, signifying him finally taking responsibility for his actions. Perhaps he and Dany will meet once again way down the line, and though their relationship won't exactly be mended, Dany will be happy to see a more mature Jorah finally taking responsibility for himself and how he has seemingly found some sort of direction in his life rather than just pining after her. Perhaps the Night's Watch fights alongside Dany at some point, and Jorah comes to her rescue, dying at her side as he does in the show. Again, just a theory, but this seems like a plausible and satisfying way for his arc to end. Also considering this theory seems to line up pretty well with the events of the show. But in any case, as I said, Jorah's show arc seems to work pretty well. So why is he getting an episode? Well, at first I wasn't really sure. I felt there was something off about Jorah's arc in the show, and I really couldn't put my finger on it. I knew I needed to fix something, but at the time I didn't know what it was. After sitting with it for a while, I realized that my lack of complete satisfaction with Jorah's arc was actually twofold. One, I don't think the show effectively reconciled Jorah's redemption in the eyes of both his father and the people of Bear Island. As I said, there is a possibility that Jorah will end up joining the Night's Watch in the book, which will serve as his source of redemption. Now in the show, Jorah does end up fighting alongside the Northerners against the Night King, but I feel like the fact that Jorah is a disgraced exiled criminal isn't really addressed. I understand at this point shit is about to go down, so I am sure that is the least point of concern for pretty much anyone at this point. But even when Jorah speaks with Lyanna Mormont before the battle begins, there really is no mention of the fact that he fled Westeros in shame. Did the people of Bear Island just forget about the fact that Jorah brought shame to their entire house? Again, maybe they just let bygones be bygones towards the end there, but it seems like it was really glossed over. I would have liked to see a solidified plot beat of Jorah reconciling his past with the people of Bear Island. And 2, well, this doesn't actually have anything to do with the conclusion of Jorah's arc at all, but rather Dany's. In the show, yes, it is nice to see Jorah dedicating his entire life to serving Dany and him dying by her side, but all of that is sort of spoiled by...
Oh, that's hot. That's hot.
Since in the show, Dany ultimately is turned into a psychotic tyrant for the endgame, it makes the fact that Jorah gave his life for her during the Long Night sort of awkward. It retroactively makes his fate seem wasteful and stupid. Yes, dying protecting Dany was probably the only way Jorah would have wanted to go out, but, like with Varys, the fact that Jorah didn't seem to realize that Dany was going to go CBP makes him seem like a moron. Also, since he is much more sympathetic and charismatic in the show, it makes it even more of a drag that he gave his life for a chick who ended up being a psycho, which becomes even more of a drag when you remember that his infatuation with his former wife led him to ruin. So having Dany go on to torch a shit ton of innocent civilians certainly casts a shadow over his magnanimous final act. So for Jorah's rewrite, we need to take care of 2 things. We need to solidify Jorah's redemption in the eyes of House Mormont, and we need to give Jorah a death that isn't spoiled by Dany's eventual burning of King's Landing. Luckily enough, the perspective theory as to how Jorah's arc will end in the book actually hits both of these right on the head. By having Dany banish Jorah before she heads to Westeros, and by having Jorah travel to Westeros at some point after he hears of his father's dying request, and by having him join the Night's Watch to fulfill that request, and by having him die in the service of the Night's Watch, perhaps fighting alongside Dany's forces, this not only allows Jorah to redeem himself to his father, and perhaps even the North as a whole, but since he will die fighting for the Night's Watch in the North, more so than just Dany, Dany's very probable burning of King's Landing, following Jorah's death, won't cast as much of a shadow over Jorah's final sacrifice. Come to think of it, if things play out in the book as I have outlined, Jorah doesn't even need to necessarily die at the end of the series. Perhaps he will survive and continue serving the Night's Watch as a way to honor his father. While on the show his love for Dany is his defining characteristic, in the book, his doomed infatuation with her is simply a catalyst for him realizing that he cannot keep running from his past, and must eventually return to Westeros to answer for his past decisions. But since we are dealing with show Jorah, what with his different dynamic with Dany, his reconciliation with her before she heads off to Westeros, and the fact that we are going with a darker version of Dany in the second half of the series, we need to do a bit of legwork to make the book theory I laid out fit in with our rewrite. So let's get to it. For Jorah, we are going to keep his arc intact all the way up through Season 6. Seems pretty late in the game, I know, but as I said, I think the show's interpretation of Jorah works well with the adaptation as a whole. Jorah being more sympathetic and likable works, as does the rowing back on his perviness for Dany, as does the show's demonstrating that Jorah loves Dany for who she is, rather than just chasing some delusional fantasy, as he does in the book. Now, as I said, we are going with a somewhat darker version of Dany for our rewrite, with her starting to go off the deep end as early as the end of Season 5, after Tyrion arrives in Meereen and begins to make an effort to turn her to the dark side. But since Jorah doesn't really interact all that much with Dany from when he is banished at the end of Season 4 until he travels to Dragonstone Season 7, it really isn't all that much of a factor. He sees her briefly when he arrives back in Meereen with Tyrion and is banished for a second time. He sees her for a moment in the fighting pits, but they share no words. And then there is their brief meeting before Jorah leaves to find a cure for his grayscale. Since they have such limited time together in these scenes, even if we go with a more blatantly bloodthirsty Dany in the later seasons, Jorah doesn't spend enough time with Dany to notice. That is until he travels to Dragonstone in Season 7. But since our rewrite has Dany starting to dispel the more volatile side of her personality in the latter half of Season 7, and since Jorah doesn't roll up to Dragonstone until Episode 5, by this time, Dany hasn't gone completely CBP. The reason I am making a big deal out of this is due to the fact that, if Dany is shown to be going off the deep end much earlier in the series, rather than way later into the game, this may result in a number of characters starting to question their allegiance to her much earlier, and if they don't, it may seem like their intelligence is being nerfed in order to make the intended endgame play out as it did. This is a problem that both Tyrion and Varys run into in the show. If Dany was shown to be CBP earlier, then I assume both Varys and Tyrion would take note, seeing as how perceptive they are. In order to avoid this, the show doesn't make Dany start to go nutty until 2 episodes before the finale, which feels rushed as balls. Had the writers paced her descent into bloodlust slower throughout the previous seasons, yes, her snapping in the penultimate episode would seem less contrived, but would both Tyrion and Varys have stuck by her side for that long, knowing that she was perhaps a loose cannon? Probs not. We already addressed this in Tyrion and Varys' episodes as to why this won't be a problem in our rewrite. We will also have to deal with this problem with Barristan since he is actually going to survive much longer than he does in the show, but we will discuss that next episode. But as for Jorah, it's a bit more complicated. Show Jorah seems a lot more confident and put together. So if Dany started to show signs that she was letting her bloodlust get to her, I am sure Jorah would either step in and try to talk her down, or at some point just leave her. Yes, he does love her in the show, but given Jorah's characterization, I cannot see him sticking with her all the way up until season 8 if he sees that she is starting to go a bit crazy. In the book, this is a moot point, since Jorah isn't able to see Dany clearly in the first place. I've talked before how Dany is characterized as a bit more unbalanced in the books than in the show, but since Jorah is so much more of a simp in the book, he is so blinded by his infatuation with her that he most likely wouldn't have the sense to walk away no matter what she ends up doing. But again, despite our rewrite having Dany's descent into bloodlust happen as early as late in season 5, since Jorah spends so little time with Dany and in such brief intervals, I think we can buy that Jorah did not realize how far Dany was starting to slip. And when he meets with her in the latter half of season 7, Dany is trying to be the benevolent ruler she always dreamt of being. So again, Jorah has nothing to fear. However, I think it would be interesting to have Jorah be a bit skeptical towards Tyrion. Since he and Jorah traveled together in season 5, Jorah may be a bit cautious of Tyrion, a bit paranoid that he is trying to make Dany pull an Anakin Skywalker. But since Jon has been inspiring her to be all magnanimous and shit, Jorah feels that he doesn't have anything to worry about. That is until season 8 episode 2, when, after Jaime arrives and tells Dany that Cersei has no intention of sending reinforcements to help the North against the White Walker threat, he sees the dark side of Dany rear its head, with her announcing her plans to torch Cersei as soon as they take care of the Night King. While Jorah is no stranger to the take no prisoners side of Dany, he realizes something has changed within her. He realizes that perhaps Tyrion has already succeeded in making Dany go off the deep end, and this will lead to Jorah and Dany's final conversation before the Long Night, but we'll get to that in just a second. Now, as I said, the main issue I have with Jorah's arc is the fact that there is a lack of solid reconciliation with him bringing shame to his house when he decided to flee Westeros. Yes, there is a scene with him and Lyanna right before the Long Night begins, but there really isn't any talk about the fact that Jorah disgraced his family name. Given Lyanna's wit, I figured she would have thrown at least a little shade his way for fleeing across the narrow sea instead of accepting responsibility for his actions. It seems as if everything is all patched up, with nothing actually having happened. The other issue is that both Lyanna and Jorah die in the Long Night, thus making House Mormont basically extinct, which is, well, I don't know, maybe there is some poetry to it, but to me, it just seems like the writers sort of forgot about the fact that having both of them die means the end of House Mormont. I think by this point in the show, the writers completely forgot about all houses and lineages and all that shit, so they may not have realized the implications of having both Jorah and Lyanna die. In order to rectify this whole deal with Jorah reconciling with House Mormont, I would add a scene in episode 1 of season 8 that features Jorah approaching Lyanna and the remnants of House Mormont. Perhaps he speaks of his father and how he wishes he could have been there for him. Perhaps if Jorah had joined the Night's Watch way back when, he could have saved his father during the mutiny of Craster's Keep. Lyanna and the other Mormonts aren't really having it, as they still consider Jorah a coward who brought dishonor to their house. While they respect him for being here now and fighting alongside them, they refuse to fraternize with him beyond that. Jorah is left dejected, realizing that he may never re-earn the respect of his people. Come episode 2, as we discussed, Jorah will see that Dany may be letting her bloodlust get the best of her, after she pledges to snuff Cersei out following the Long Night. He tries to speak with her, but at that moment she isn't having it and walks off, leaving him dejected once again. As the Northerners begin their preparations for the Long Night, Jorah learns, as we see in the show, that Lyanna Mormont plans to fight on the front lines, rather than hide in the crypts. Jorah approaches Lyanna and begs her to stay in the crypts, thus ensuring her safety and the future of House Mormont. But Lyanna refuses, saying that while she doesn't want House Mormont to go extinct, she cannot bear to run and hide while her men give it their all on the front lines. Jorah sees a strength in Lyanna that he lacked back when he decided to flee Westeros. Realizing this, Jorah knows what he must do. Before the Long Night is to begin, Jorah visits Dany in her chambers in what will be their final conversation. They talk, reminisce, go over everything they have been through, the ups and downs, the good and the bad. As he did the day he left to cure his grayscale, Jorah pledges his love for Dany and accepts that she will never feel the same way. He pleads with her to stay true to who she is and to not let hate and anger take hold of her. Dany promises she will and asks him to take heed when he leads her cavalry into battle. It is at this moment that Jorah tells her that, rather than leading her cavalry, he wishes to stand with the men and women of House Mormont and fight alongside them. He says that though he loves her and will always serve her, in order to honor his home and his people, he must make it up to them in this way. Dany, who herself has been driven by an urge to return to her homeland and honor her ancestors, understands, and though it is hard for her, gives Jorah her blessing to fight alongside House Mormont. They share a final goodbye as Jorah leaves. Just as the battle is to begin, Jorah approaches Lyanna and the rest of House Mormont, and though he knows they may not forgive or accept him, he has to fight by their side in memory of his father. Having now earned a bit more respect for him, Lyanna accepts. Just as they are to take their positions, this is when Sam arrives with Heartsbane and gives it to Jorah. Sam reminds Jorah of his father's dying words. I think we should add them into the show as they are in the book, that his father wished for Jorah to one day return home. Jorah then falls in line with House Mormont with Heartsbane on his belt, fulfilling his father's dying wish. The battle begins and we see Jorah and the rest of House Mormont fight with everything they've got. Now I am sure many of you would like to have us go with Jorah dying protecting Dany and dying by her side. However, as I said, my only issue with this is, even though I think our rewrite scenario successfully reconciles Jorah's relationship with his house and his father's dying wish, I still feel like Jorah dying by Dany's side is a bit fanservice-y, and is still rained on a bit by Dany's eventual turn to the dark side. We could still have Jorah die by Dany's side, and then just have Lyanna live, thus becoming head of House Mormont, and then have her pardon Jorah for his past crimes due to his bravery in battle. We could go with that, but I would personally prefer a different scenario. During the battle against the Night King, we see Jorah fight like hell alongside House Mormont. As he looks around the battlefield, he sees Lyanna as she squares off against either the undead giant or a group of whites. As Lyanna is being overwhelmed and about to be killed, Jorah makes his decision as he steps in and defends her, being stabbed multiple times in the process and dying defending the heir to House Mormont. Following the battle, after seeing Jorah's sacrifice for the future of House Mormont, Lyanna and the rest have been instilled with a newfound respect for Jorah and feel that despite his past, he has truly redeemed himself. This means that Dany will not be by Jorah's side at his death, and will only learn of his death after the battle and must say goodbye to him on his funeral pyre. Now, while it may seem odd that I don't like having Jorah dying by Dany's side, my reasoning for not having him go like this is at the end of Season 5, I felt that him battling out in the fighting pits is a great moment of agency for him. Before this, he more or less followed Dany around like a puppy dog. Their relationship seemed to evolve, however, with it becoming less one-sided and more of one sprouting from mutual respect, and that, despite their close relationship, they were in fact two separate individuals with their own agency. By having Jorah die defending House Mormont, thus making up for his past mistakes, I think it is more in line with him gaining a sense of agency separate from Dany. And hell, I think it would even be the way that Dany would want him to go out. Despite her sadness for not being with him in the end, Dany relays to Jon that she finds solace in the fact that Jorah was able to find something to fight for on his own. Dany knew that she could never love Jorah as he loved her, and seemed to always want him to be able to move on from his delusions of romance with her. In the end, he did just that. It is somewhat of a bittersweet ending, but I think that is proper, considering how a number of changes made in this rewrite are a bit more fan-servicey, if you will. Jorah Mormont, a man who fled from his homeland due to his refusal to take responsibility for his actions, loses himself and his identity to the point where he will take any work he can find, including working for the Master of Whispers himself. But by finding love for the very person he was employed to betray, Jorah eventually finds something worth fighting for, and even someone to love. But unfortunately, not only is he eventually punished for spying on the woman he has fallen for, he also must come to terms with the fact that she will never return the love he has for her. Though he wallows in his own sorrow for a while, doing anything he can to win her over, he decides to accept his reality and fight for the woman he has pledged himself to, despite the fact that he knows she will never feel for him how he wishes her to. He travels the land and does whatever it takes, no matter how much suffering he must endure, to return to her side, to spend the rest of his life serving his queen. But in the end, when it comes time to defend his queen from the greatest threat the land has ever seen, he realizes that despite what he wants, he cannot be by her side, but rather must repent for his past mistakes and redeem himself in the eyes of the people whom he brought dishonor to. And with his final sacrifice, by saving the heir of his namesake and ensuring the preservation of the house he brought shame to, he not only redeems himself in the eyes of his house, fulfilling his father's dying wish to return home and take responsibility for his crimes, but also shows the woman he loves the depth of his character, in that he put aside his dreams of being beside her to repent for his past. And that will conclude today's episode, fam. Now before we end, I just want to give a quick update on the series. We are on the home stretch now, with only about 4 or 5 episodes to go before the finale. I was flip-flopping on whether or not I wanted to do a miscellaneous episode, which would feature an array of smaller changes to characters who I don't feel like warrant an entire individual episode. But I have decided that I'm going to wrap that up with the big finale video, where we walk through our entire rewrite of the series, since that video is probably going to be monster length anyway. Something else to keep an eye out for before the end of the series, I am going to at some point send out a series of polls for all of you to vote on in regards to some rewrite plot points I am torn on. So for example, should Jorah die by Dany's side as he does in the show? Or do you think the scenario I have presented in this episode serves as a better finale to his arc? I like to consider the series as a collaborative effort, since your comments on each episode give me insight to the characters and take into account things I may have missed in my analysis. For example, the scenario that I presented in Dany's video as to what will lead her to burning the citizens of King's Landing. Per the comments on her episode, I could tell that a lot of you felt the logic of the scenario didn't hold. So we changed it up a bit in Theon's episode, offering a different scenario. It'll probably be a dozen or so questions regarding some of the more major plot points in the series, so keep an eye out for that as we get closer to the finale. Next episode, we take a shot at redoing the arc of Barristan Balls of Steel Selmy, seeing as his death in the show was the source of palpable disappointment for pretty much the entire fanbase. However, I have a feeling that a lot of y'all, especially those who have not read the books, will find our path for Barristan quite controversial, but we will go into depth into all of that next episode. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.